Welcome to lesson 5.5. In this lesson, we're going to talk about hyperbolas. So, little review for this chapter. We have done circles, we have done parabolas, we have done ellipses. Last conic section we need to talk about is hyperbolas. So once again, lock away all the rules you've learned so far for all the other shapes. And today we're going to give you a new set of vocabulary and a new set of rules. So let's start by reviewing our vocab. We're going to start right here with our center, like always. We've done the center every time, and just like always, your center is always H, K. The next vocab we have is our first new one. It is the transverse axis, is what it's called. Transverse axis. And this transverse axis connects the two vertices of our hyperbolas. So just like we had two vertices for an ellipse, we have two vertices for a hyperbola. Now, another vocabulary word. These red pieces of our hyperbola, we call those the two branches of our hyperbola. So the vertices go at the middle of those branches, and the transverse axis connects the vertices. Next vocabulary word we have is this perpendicular axis, which we call the conjugate axis. That's our conjugate axis. Now, the reason we have our conjugate axis and our transverse axis is from these two perpendicular lines, we draw what is called the guide rectangle for our hyperbolas. So basically, we connect the two perpendicular axes in a rectangular shape, and that's our guide rectangle. The reason we come up with a guide rectangle is because we're going to go draw diagonal lines through the guide rectangle. So that's these lines right here through the guide rectangle. And these lines will actually become asymptotes. So these are the two lines that your branches of your hyperbola follow but never cross. And you can see that here. The branches follow this asymptote line, but they don't cross it. So let's do, this is an asymptote. This is an asymptote. And then we only have one vocab word left, and that is our foci. Just like an ellipse, we have two of them. Plural of focus. And notice that our two foci go inside the hyperbola branches. They are also along the transverse axis. And they are also symmetrical. That will always hold true. Your foci will be symmetrical over the center. They will lie on the transverse axis, and they'll be inside your branches. Now, one last thing. We are going to calculate C, like we did with our ellipses. And that C is the distance from the center to the focus. That's the little c that we'll be calculating later today. So, those are all the important terms with our hyperbola. Now let's look at those terms in the equation. So first thing you'll note when we look at our equation is we have two versions of our equation here. In this top version, we have x that comes first, and then we have this big minus sign. In the bottom version, we have y that comes first, and then we have this big minus sign. You will probably also notice that these equations look awfully similar to the ellipse equation. The only difference is that now we're subtracting these two fractions instead of adding them like we did for an ellipse. Now let's talk about the difference between the two equations. If x comes first, so x minus y, that means the branches of your hyperbola are going to go side to side. If y comes first and then subtract x, that means the branches of your hyperbola will go up and down. So that's the difference between the two equations. Now let's talk about what's in the equations. First thing we've got is, of course, h and k. H and k, which is our center point. Next thing we have is our transverse axis and our conjugate axis. Now, for a hyperbola, you need to remember that the transverse axis is whichever number comes first in the equation. So in this one, the transverse axis will be A, because it comes first. Whereas for the one down here, our transverse axis will be B, because now B is coming first. And then the conjugate axis is the other one, is the one that comes second. So in this one, it's B. And in the bottom one, it's A. So those are the important parts of our equations. Remember, these equations are on your reference sheet, so you don't need to memorize them. You just need to be able to know what each part of the equation does. The last thing I want to mention, also on your reference sheet, is the equation for little c. Remember, this is the distance from the center to the foci. That's what that little c calculates. You'll also notice this little c equation looks very similar to the ellipse equation. We're just adding instead of subtracting. And once again, you don't need to memorize this. That is also on your reference sheet. You just have to know what it does. So that is everything with our hyperbola, all our important vocab words, identifying the things in the equation. In the next video, we're going to do our first job at graphing one.